right. Thanks everybody for being here. We'll fix our little remote microphone issues. And this talk is from CRob and Madison Oliver. And they're going to talk about crossing streams, how downstream can understand upstream vulnerabilities. And a couple of announcements. Again, thanks for coming to the inaugural VulnCon 2024. We really appreciate seeing such great attendance. Session surveys are available in the conference mobile app or via QR codes found around the venue on table tents. Cell phones, I doubt that anybody needs to know that, but just remember to turn off or down your cell phone. And pictures and video is not allowed unless it's explicitly allowed by your presenters. However, all of these sessions are being recorded, as well as the slides will be published on first.org, and the video will be on YouTube. Yeah, that should be it. So with that, let's get started. Oh, one last thing. We will have mics available for questions. There will be Q&A at the end of this talk. If you don't talk into a mic, the folks online cannot hear your question. So we'll have mics coming around for a Q&A time. With that, I'll hand it off to our presenters.
How about? Yeah. There.
Cool. Hi, everybody. Yeah.
Hi, Madison.
Am I not loud enough? Somehow, this is going? Okay. I'll be very loud, I promise. We'll take a second to introduce ourselves. Hi, everybody. My name is Madison Oliver. I work at GitHub managing our advisory database curation team. Prior to GitHub, I worked at the CERT Coordination Center, coordinating vulnerabilities on behalf of the US government. My handle is @Taladrain. I consider myself to be a security, transparency, and disclosure advocate. I'm a cat fancier and a World of Warcraft enthusiast.
Hey, everybody. I'm CRob. I do stuff on the internet, and we're going to talk about how open source manages vulnerabilities. I've had the great pleasure to be involved in upstream open source security for about a decade, and Madison, being a representative of GitHub, gets to deal with it every day. Dummy. There we go. So here's a brief agenda, what we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about why coordinated vulnerability disclosure is important. We're going to talk about what makes it hard, talk about some organizations and people that are trying to help make it better. And then we'll get into how upstream, some practices we recommend to upstream, and how downstream can understand what upstream is doing. And then we'll have a call to action.
So first and foremost, we'll start with why coordinated vulnerability disclosure is important. Before we get into that, we will first define what coordinated vulnerability disclosure is and what we mean when we're saying that. So coordinated vulnerability disclosure, CVD, as we'll refer to it for the rest of this, because we're going to say that a lot, is the process of gathering information from vulnerability finders, coordinators, which can take a number of different ways and can include a number of different folks, sharing that information between relevant stakeholders and disclosing the existence of the vulnerability in the software, their mitigations, and their mitigations to various stakeholders, including the public. Most notably, all of this will be disclosed to the public. Some principles of coordinated vulnerability disclosure include harm reduction. You want to reduce the harm caused to your users, your constituents, yourself even. You want to presume benevolence. You want to trust by default. You want to assume that if somebody is disclosing to you or you are disclosing to them, that it is in your best interest, their best interest. They are not doing this out of the badness of their heart or maliciously in any way. You also want to avoid surprises. You want to incentivize the desired behavior. So if you're an organization that wants to accept vulnerability reports, you want to incentivize folks to give you those reports, incentivize them when they do as well. And you can take this back to your processes then, improve them along the way with the information that you're getting from this coordinated disclosure effort. Oh, sorry.
No, you're cool. So CVD, from our perspective, it really helps ensure that the maintainer and the project has access to the resources they need to be able to analyze the problem, perform some tests to validate that it is a problem or not, and then be able to develop a patch, again, test that, and then fix that and get that down to their downstream consumers. And we'll talk a lot about up and downstream. We have an awesome slide about that in a moment if you're not familiar with that terminology. But our perspective here, Madison and I are talking about on behalf of Upstream, the actual creators and maintainers and developers of the open source software that filters down, that my friend Brian Fox and his company state make up about 90% of all commercial software has open source components. So it's very important that the projects and the developers have access and have that communication, that line of communication open so they can perform these things. And the goal is, and every community, like a little asterisk here, we work in open source. We don't represent the open source. It's a lot of different flavors on how a project may do these things. Some of them, I have a slide a little bit, the very mature, very robust security programs. Others might not, and we'll talk about some reasons why. But the goal of all this is to make sure that when the fixes are available, everyone, all the consumers downstream, whether that's a corporation, it's another developer that's writing software, that they have access to the fixes at the same time. Our little chart here may illustrate to you the importance of open source and open source components. This is a tour. Not all these are open source, like the SolarWinds isn't, but anyone that deals with incident response is very well aware of these celebrity branded vulnerabilities that cause a lot of anxiety, both from consumers as well as developers, and actually draws a lot of burden and additional work on a open source developer that as these things come up, they'll be constantly asked, hey, I heard about this Heartbleed thing. Is your project affected? When are you getting a fix? So whenever these kind of brand name things show up, creates a lot of additional work for maintainers.
Vulnerability disclosure as a whole can take a number of different forms. First and foremost, two-party bilateral vulnerability coordination is pretty self-explanatory, right? Two parties, a finder, whoever has found or is reporting on behalf of somebody the vulnerability to the maintainer or the code owner. Pretty simple one-to-one relationship. Beyond that is multi-party vulnerability disclosure, which can include the maintainer. It can include third parties like a third-party coordinator, patch creator, the researcher themselves, the finder, a number of different entities. And a step beyond that is coordinated vulnerability disclosure, which includes a formal coordinator. It can be a third-party coordinator like a CERT, something established by a national entity. It can also include maybe a large stakeholder, especially in the ecosystem, like a Google or a GitHub even, or a Red Hat. So coordinator can take on many different forms. It doesn't always explicitly mean a coordinator like a CERT, right? It could be somebody facilitating that same sort of role.
And thinking about open source specifically, some very tangible benefits that following a CVD process allows. First off, it allows to bring in skills into that remediation that the project might not have. Developer may not be trained in secure coding or might not understand what's being shared with them. So CVD gives them a means to read other people in, to bring those skills in. They might not have a communications team. They might not have a lawyer, for example. And CVD allows that ability to include these people that have that need to know. Also, it provides the means to have broader regression testing, as opposed to one developer doing the test and, hey, it worked, no failures. It gives more people the ability to look at, provide feedback, and ultimately provide a better, more robust solution downstream. It helps prepare the ecosystem, and especially when you think about these large projects like the kernel or OpenSSL, Log4j, these large projects that are embedded into a lot of other pieces of software. We need to be able to make sure that the downstream, once that fix is ready, that they can stage it so that their downstreams can have access to all the materials and documentation. Yeah. So this is, I teased this. This is kind of why, especially in open source, coordinated vulnerability disclosure is hard. I chunked up the open source into 3 broad categories. And my friend Josh Breschers a couple of years ago did some analysis on the publicly available source code repositories. And statistically looking, he found that there were a couple dozen, maybe, very large projects that have a security team. They have a vulnerability disclosure program. They have testing suites. They have all these amazing capabilities. Things like Kubernetes, the kernel, the Apache Software Foundation. These folks have dedicated security teams. So that's dozens of open source projects have that. Moving to the next category, there are hundreds of projects that have between 2 and 100 maintainers. So these are kind of, the next step down. They might not be, grab all the attention like a Kubernetes might, but these folks might have a security team. Worst case, they have security experts in the project, but those projects are maintained from between 2 and 100 people. Hundreds. Then we move on to the last category, which is, at the time he did his report, there were over 16 million open source projects that had a maintainer, a single maintainer that wrote and maintains that software. So you can see there's a wide disparity in capabilities within the community. And we kind of tossed in, there's a lot of reasons why people write open source software. The very last one is they get paid money to do it by somebody. The majority of people that write open source software, they see it as an expression of individual creativity. They have a problem they're trying to solve and they're sharing the solution with the world. Some people want fame and recognition from their peers. Oh my goodness, this was the most elegant code ever. So there's just a lot of different reasons, and there's no one why people write, contribute, and support open source software.
There are also a lot of reasons why OSS CVD can be difficult. First and foremost, determining who and how to contact somebody is quite complicated. Let's say maybe you can even narrow it down to a GitHub handle. How do you go from that to a private way to securely share information with them? There are a couple of ways that you could do that, but it is often not straightforward, and it's very hard to find, I have a vulnerability or have found a vulnerability in this project. Who do I tell, and how can I share this with them? It's even more complicated in open source because the project could no longer be maintained. It could have transferred ownership. If there's a public record of that, that can be easy to make those connections. How often is there a public record of that? How often are projects or repos archived with very little information shared otherwise? It makes it very, very hard to, again, know who to tell or how to tell them. Open source development often moves at the speed of light, I like to say. It's very, very fast, typically. So coordinated vulnerability disclosure is often not a very quick process. There are a number of different stakeholders involved. Throughout the process, you might also learn and discover that more folks need to be involved. So there are a number of reasons, and I'd say very valid reasons, why the timeline and process can be delayed. To an open source developer, that can feel like the worst. It's so slow, especially compared to development at the speed of light. So that can make doing this in an open source context a lot more difficult and create some more friction. In addition to that, some of what we talked about in our last slide for motivations and reasons why maintainers are developing open source software is typically, right, they care a lot. Maybe they're being paid for it. It's something they're passionate about. They're doing development. It doesn't inherently or necessarily mean that they are doing security. So their project that they are developing on might not have incident response capabilities, security capabilities on the project. So if a vulnerability even is disclosed to them, let's say you can find the right folks, they might not have the capability, the means, the capacity to even handle that, to respond to it in real any way.
And we did a little illustration of one of our last points to kind of show the communications workflow for open source projects can vary greatly. And depending on the size, capability, and maturity of the project, they may have dedicated teams, they may not. They may have, you know, Jane, the security gal that does all the security stuff, which could just be advisories. So we, you know, it drastically varies. And then when you get into like the multi-party coordinated disclosure, like when you're dealing with something that potentially you have somebody like the Linux distributions helping coordinate, there's a lot of different players that get in there that have opinions and feedback on the process.
We had mentioned briefly earlier that we were going to define some terms. When we are talking about upstream and downstream, this is what we mean. So to us, upstream is the creator or the supplier of the software, components, and libraries. Downstream is the consumer of software that they themselves did not create. I don't know how many folks recognize who this is, but this is Dr. Egon Spengler from the 1984 Ghostbusters movie, who very famously said, huh? Thank you, Todd. So he famously said, don't cross the streams. It would be bad. So the reason he was saying this is, of course, not talking about upstream and downstream and open source. He was talking about proton streams. And the reason for not doing that is because it would be world ending. But I would like to make the argument that crossing streams in open source is absolutely necessary and exactly what we need to be doing. So please ignore his advice. Please cross all the streams responsibly, of course, right? Reasonably so. But we are very much advocating that all of the streams should be crossed. Do not be afraid to go up. Don't be afraid to go down. And please ignore his advice.
And we just provided a very generic open source kind of intake and workflow. Not every project will do this. They may have more steps. They could have less steps. They could be, you know, we don't think any bug is a security thing. Mileage varies, but this in general, most projects will follow something similar where they get the report, they do some triage, they'll try to reproduce it. Then they will work on creating a patch. After that, they will work on validating, did the patch in fact work, fix the thing, and then they'll push out advisory, a GitHub commit, or push out the software so that their downstream can take all that. And the complication here is that open source software, in the first word, open, everything is done in public view. So there are certain steps sometimes that need to be taken to kind of go against a lot of the open source ethos and make things temporarily private so that things can work so that you're not harming your downstream. So we'll talk a little bit about that later. But basically, this whole process generally is designed to work 1000% publicly transparent. And I think, you know, we both agree that vulnerability disclosure ultimately is a human process. And people have feelings and individual motivations. We don't always get along or see eye to eye. When there is a vulnerability, it is a time of anxiety all around. So your stress level and the pressure is growing. And, you know, understanding the motivations of the reporter and the reporter understanding the motivations of the maintainer and the project team, it's critical to understand kind of how the project team views vulnerability intake, how they view vulnerability reports, and both sides really need to assume positive intent. All right, so there is a group of people trying to help. Madison and I both work within a foundation called the Open Source Security Foundation. It was founded almost 4 years ago by several large industry people, also with security researchers and open source maintainers and academics. And we are a group of people dedicated towards trying to help raise the security profile of open source software for the whole ecosystem. It's a cross-industry effort. It's a vendor-neutral space. And we have a lot of different projects where we collaborate on specific tasks around open source software development, testing, creation, pipelining, and then ultimately delivery. To give you a quick taste, this is as of 3 weeks ago, all of our current projects, working groups, and SIGs. We're spread out in a lot of different areas. And these slides will be available. And this is also out in our GitHub repo if anyone cares. If anyone's curious about what's up with all the damn geese, I have a link to a blog that talks about where the goose where Hunk came from. But we have, Madison and I are the co-leads of down here in this corner. You can barely see it. We co-lead the Vulnerability Disclosure Working Group, which is a representation of security experts, Linux distribution people, maintainers, security researchers, and academics focused on trying to help uplift the open source ecosystem, provide tooling, practices, advice, a big brother, big sister, if anyone needs help in kind of doing this very hard task. So you want to talk about what Upstream does for CVD?
Yes. So if we take a second to remember what became, take a second to remember Newton's second law of motion for what eventually became known as gravity. I would argue what goes up must come down, and the same applies to upstream and downstream when we're talking about coordinated vulnerability disclosure. Anything that is reported up should be reported down, and I would argue vice versa. So I'm showing you a very complicated, complex graphic. Please do not be alarmed. This is yet another representation of what coordinated vulnerability disclosure can look like in open source, outside of open source, and a reminder about where you might be sitting can vary a lot depending on this picture too. Your perspective might be as a downstream consumer, as an upstream provider, as a finder, as a coordinator. And you could fit in almost any different place in this, I'm sure of it. So CVD, coordinated vulnerability disclosure, ideally in a perfect world, right, would start upstream. Again, in a perfect world. It would then be shared downstream. Downstream can learn about issues in all of the same places, some of the same places as upstream can. There are also coordinators involved in this, defenders involved in this, users involved in this. So how long this takes can vary a lot. How many folks are involved in each stage can also vary a lot, especially in open source. So some different ways that you might see this in practice. And please keep in mind that your mileage may vary. I'm going to share a couple of high-level, well-known examples, and all of this is pulled from their security policies. All of this is very public. But again, these are just examples. Not every project operates the same way. So there might be a challenge in coordinated vulnerability disclosure, determining who and how to contact somebody downstream, right? Very common problem. And here are two different ways that we've seen folks try to solve for this problem. So establishing a relationship with your up and downstream beforehand can save you a ton of time. Again, during an incident, it is very high intensity. If you do not have context set up already, it could take some time. It could delay you. I strongly encourage everybody to set up contacts before you need them. So we see this very commonly, again, in runtimes and frameworks. Node.js and Electron have a very tightly close working relationship when it comes to vulnerability disclosure. You can also establish the bare minimum, right? Set your bar wherever your bare minimum is and notify all at public disclosure. This is very commonly what the Linux kernel does. Another challenge, right? Speed, timeliness, notifications. All of those can take a very long time. It could also be instantaneous. So we've seen, again, different ways for folks to solve for the same challenge. So Node.js, as an example, they explicitly call out that they could have elongated timelines because of the coordinated nature that they need to take, especially as a framework. We also see folks like Debian calling out in their security policy that they're going to do what they can to avoid embargo timelines because of the complications that arise from that. And another challenge that we often see in open source is that the project needs resources. So two different ways that I've seen where projects have tried to mitigate and try to get around that challenge include Electron includes upstream patches downstream, right? From Node.js, they call that out very explicitly, and they say that you are getting Node.js patches if you are installing the latest version of Electron. They say that very outright. We also see folks like Node.js. They had a fantastic presentation at the last OpenJS Day, where they talked about using volunteers from their community to handle incident response. So they open it up beyond even core maintainers of the project to bring in folks from the community. And again, like folks that have been deeply engaged, that have the subject knowledge to do this properly, but will also rely on volunteers as opposed to paid folks when they need it.
One of the artifacts, one of the set of artifacts that our group has worked on is two guides. The first one was a coordinated vulnerability disclosure guide focused on open source projects and maintainers. providing advice. If you are an open source project or maintainer, here's some things you can do, some templates, some steps, some contacts of how you can do CVD better. Then we realized that's only like a third of the audience. So our second artifact was the CVD guide for finders. Security researchers are amazing people, very curious and inquisitive, but they aren't necessarily open source experts. So we tried to explain to that particular security research community, this is how Upstream works. This is how you can proactively and effectively engage with an open source developer so that you have the most successful disclosure you can. And then we have in the works a CVD guide for open source consumers that we'll be publishing later this year that will help teach enterprises or anyone that uses open source software. These are some tips and tricks you can use to understand how your Upstream works and where you can monitor for signals when things are getting fixed and released. And we went through, and here's a series, it's kind of an excerpt from those guides where we talk about these are practices we recommend open source developers and projects to adopt. And we talk about how Downstream can learn from that. So you want to start with the first one?
Sure. Upstream, I strongly encourage you to please publish your vulnerability management process and security policy publicly. Make sure it's available, especially if you want folks to adhere to it or follow it in some way. They need to be able to find it and to see it and to access it. So each project operates differently and each project has different needs. There are plenty of security policy templates. We have some in our guides that you are more than welcome to use. But keep in mind, they can vary for, again, lots of reasons. But if you tell folks how you want to receive reports, what you expect, what information they need to have, and set expectations for their timelines, here's when we'll get back to you. Here's when we won't. Here's what you can expect from us. It can make this whole process a lot smoother. And for our Downstream folks looking for, their security alias, security at whatever the project top level domain is, addresses, following that, security.md files are amazing, or security.txt files even, and using tools like the OpenSSF security insights to learn about how the project does security can also be another way to find this information.
Our next step we recommend open source developers to adopt is establishing some type of security team. Some groups, like again, the kernel has a lot of resources, a lot of people contribute and participate there. So they have a dedicated kernel security team. One person project may or may not have access to that training, that ability, those tools. So we say, as Madison mentioned up front, it's much easier to get these things established before there's a crisis, as opposed to trying to put the wings on the airplane when you're taking off. And for Downstream, you all, whether you know it or not, you're consuming open source software. Does anyone have a cellular phone? Yeah, it's a open source based at its core. You need to understand what the capabilities of those Upstream projects that you are consuming, what they can and can't do. So does that software that you know and love, like OpenSSL, does it have a security team? If it doesn't, what steps do you need to take to mitigate that risk for yourselves as that consumer? Do you need to find an alternative? Are there other projects that deliver that same capability but have a security team or a security expert? You need to do some research. And there are some tools like the OpenSSF scorecard and All-Star that help provide some information to every user of open source software about how you can learn about the security qualities and practices your project, your favorite project, may or may not be using.
Would strongly recommend that all of our Upstream folks establish a CVE numbering authority contact or another means of using a vulnerability identifier for disclosure. So it's very important that these are found and fixed downstream. So having an identifier can be another way that your downstream consumers can learn about this information and key in off of it. A CNA, as I'm sure many folks here are likely acutely aware.
Yep, heard of it.
It's the CVE numbering authority. And again, this is taking place of the CVE CNA Summit this year. So I'm going to assume you all know what that is. But there are many other ID methods too that you can use to fill some of that need, especially while you're coordinating, like GitHub Security Advisory ID, OSV ID, GSD. These are all CVE compatible, very open source friendly. And you could also consider becoming a CNA yourselves. We Our working group has recently published a guide for open source projects to become a CNA. So also, if anybody has questions about that here, please let us know. We would be happy to discuss that.
That was written by one of our members. He joined Seth, and he wrote it for his work within the Python Foundation and used that as a model. And it's success. This was a contributor that wrote this and has donated back to the community. So it's important to have some, whether you are a CNA or you know a CNA, to be able to get the word out. Oh, and for Downstream, you need to understand what the capabilities of the software you're using has. Are they a CNA? Do they use CVE? How are you going to get information when vulnerabilities are found and fixed? And knowing, as my friend Joe said, knowing's half the battle. Knowing that something can happen and where to go look will help you in spades down the road. We touched on this a little bit earlier. Projects, it's encouraged to have some mechanism, some means to be able to take, first off, private vulnerability reports. Thank you, GitHub, for finally adding that. So that way a researcher, a finder, or a user can come to you privately and say, I think I found a problem, or I found a problem. And you can have that conversation outside the public view first to understand what's going on. You also should have some means, some mechanism to develop patches privately, not in your public repository, because the bad guys are constantly monitoring the source code repositories. And the minute they see anything, they have automation and bots built in where they're monitoring for changes or notes or signals. So a project having that means to be able to privately test and develop their patch is critical. And then, consider having an embargo list. If you're a large project and you understand who your downstreams are, and you understand that they might take a longer time to stage the patches or to get advisories out, do that work ahead of time before you're in the crisis, if you feel that serves your community. And again, recommendation for Downstream, understand the software that you're using. What capabilities do they have? Do they do any of this? Because potentially, if your project that you use, if they don't have a means to privately develop the patch outside of the public, you could be 0-dayed. You could have a bad day very quickly as things are committed into one of the Gits, and the attackers can immediately start to weaponize that before the patch is even available downstream.
You'll see this is all along the same thread. Upstream should really determine how they're going to communicate this disclosure. Do they use a mailing list? Well, are they only going to be referring to the fixes and commits using commit messages? They could be using something like a VEX statement, full-on security advisory. It can vary in size, quantity, depth, pretty substantially. But it's important for Downstream, again, to know how to expect that information, where it's going to come from, how it's going to come, how often, and why. So consider places like the OSS security mailing list for public disclosure for broader visibility. I think that's still very broadly used today and has lots of eyes on it. So it's a great first place to start. Mailing lists are a very easy way to get that information out there. And for Downstream, again, subscribing to your project releases, especially Upstream, subscribing to these security mailing lists, blogs, monitoring these things. Use Google alert searches, use OSV to track open source vulns, malicious packages, follow the foundation of your choice, of your necessity, things like that.
So as we wrap up here and we're ready to have questions, our advice for everybody is to be an informed open source consumer. Even if you are a maintainer and a creator of software, on some level, you're also a consumer. You're using libraries or components or frameworks that somebody else wrote. So being that informed consumer of open source helps not only protect your project, but also your downstream customers and the whole broader ecosystem. So these are some of the projects or efforts that are available through the OpenSSF. We have the security scorecard that provides metrics and data about security practices of projects. All-Star is an automated means of going in and validating a lot of these checks. And there's a repository you can monitor that you can check up how many stars these projects get. We have a new tool called Block, which is does dependency tree graphs. Pretty exciting work. So you can kind of see where in your supply chain there may or may not be trouble. We have the SALSA framework, which is a supply chain capabilities framework. And that's more for the people that are building the software. Once the software has been written, this is more to understand what the pipeline that software goes through, how secure that particular infrastructure may or may not be. You want to talk about the SIG store? SIG stores means a way to sign code. So that in a traditional proprietary software has had code signing for a long time. In open source, managing the certificates and code signing has been a historic challenge. SIG store is a means where it's a globally distributed ledger, very easy way for a developer to say, on this day, I did this, and for somebody to be able to go validate afterwards. We have the best practices badge, which is a manual. It's an interview where you can apply and your project can earn a little badge, a little goose with a trophy to show I did these things. So it's another means of signaling your security practices. We have VEX, and OpenVEX is another great way that you can share data. OpenVEX is a project that we adopted that implements an implementation of the VEX standard to be able to talk about the effectiveness of software. It's not replacing an advisory, but it kind of goes hand in hand with that. And it's also a lot of times paired up with software bill of materials. Want to go?
And on the OpenVEX and VEX note as well, you'll notice on the agenda that there is a day of VEX tomorrow and a number of VEX and OpenVEX related talks. So I highly encourage you to attend those if you are interested. One of the things that I think is particularly interesting about VEX and by proxy OpenVEX is the ability for a software manufacturer, maintainer to not only say, yes, I am affected by this vulnerability, but to be able to say, no, I am not, which could be of great interest both up and downstream for your consumers to have an explicit statement that says, no, we've reviewed this and we're not vulnerable to this. OSV runs both, the open source vulnerability runs a database and also a schema, a vulnerability data exchange format as well. The security best practices guide helps you configure your repo securely and safely. We have a concise guide to software consumption, which is really interesting, and it will help you understand what to look at whenever you're ingesting third-party software, which again, in open source land is all the time. So we would, again, greatly encourage everybody here to consider giving back to your projects that are important to your business. If you want to know where to put your time, effort, capacity, funding even, look at the projects that you are relying on both up and down and start there.
And we talked about a lot of stuff throughout a lot of acronyms. So does the group, either on the internet or in the room, have any questions that we could answer for you? You make Steve do some more. We have a question up front.
I think we have somebody running around with a mic, maybe?
Yes. Where was the question?
Gentleman in the fine cap.
This is Oregon. Okay. I guess this might warrant a whole separate keynote, but can you talk a little bit about generative AI and how that will impact both upstream and downstream and this complex framework of open source?
So the question was, are we able to provide any insights into how generative AI impacts all of this? I know someone that they have a platform that is incorporating generative AI. Maybe I'll let them speak first, and then I can provide some perspectives.
We're seeing generative AI impact this in a number of different ways. So both from the original finding research perspective, folks are using generative AI to find vulnerabilities. That has had very mixed results, I'll say, up to this point. So a negative impact I have seen from that personally is it's creating yet more noise in open source and more things for open source maintainers to have to deal with and respond to, which I think is very unfortunate. I'm hoping that that can improve over time as well. We have seen generative AI be useful in vulnerability disclosure and helping folks respond to things more easily, triage things more easily, validate things more easily, especially too, if you think about generating test code, test suites using generative AI. We've seen a lot of positive interactions there. So we've seen it a lot from both sides, I'll say.
And we have a working group dedicated towards AI ML security, and they are collaborating with a bunch of other foundations across the ecosystem. And they are thinking about topics about how do you protect the models? How do you share like an SBOM. How do you understand the components that go into software, the software models and tools? So we're involved a lot. And just as Madison said, I think it's a double-edged sword. Just like fuzzers, it's creating a lot more noise, and we need to get to a point where the false positive ratio is much lower so we can have better, more quality reports before we unleash the computer on the developers. Address your question? Awesome.
So I have one more note to it, to a point that we made before too. Again, right, like learning who to contact, how to contact them is very hard. When you throw generative AI in the mix, it becomes so much more complicated. Is it the model that's vulnerable, the data behind it? Who do you tell? How do you tell? And how do you begin to coordinate that? So it's just added another layer of complexity.
And I, for one, welcome our new robot overlords.
So as you were talking about upstream and downstream effectiveness of vulnerabilities, my question would be, what's your proposal to provide a consistent way of impact and risk and whatever analysis rating of vulnerabilities at one point for kind of all the downstream customers to assess?
So the question was, how is anything being done? Are we doing anything around kind of the risk assessment, the risk description, like using tools like CVSS or other kind of risk management methodologies? So both of us wear multiple hats. Madison wears the CVE hat, the GitHub hat, the OpenSSF hat, and I wear the FIRST PSIRT SIG hat, OpenSSF hat, and secret backroom open source COBOL member. So our first approach is these are generally, like CVSS is a well-documented public tool. And that if you look through our CVD guides, we describe how to get access to the CVSS calculator. And we provide links to resources where a maintainer may kind of teach themselves. And FIRST especially has some really great training around how to use CVSS. The boggle about any kind of risk management methodology, these folks are trained software engineers. Their job is they want to write software. They did not go in and get training on OpenFair or some quantitative risk assessment methodology. So it's, from our standpoint, we are trying to help provide awareness to the resources, and we're going to ideally later this year, we're going to have some training that a project could take to understand how to do a CVSS or kind of what risk management is, and kind of understand, be able to talk in terms of likelihood and impact. But it is challenging because this is very globally dispersed community, a lot of different skill levels. Mark Cox over at the Apache Foundation, he does risk management pretty well. Sean, the open source college student, doesn't have that same context.
We do have a
Here's another question.
Okay, then my follow-up question would be, I as a CNA, when can I start to give information about the products that are affected from my vendor, my company, in the authorized data provider part of CVSS 5?
How do you do that? So the question was, as a CNA and a provider to a downstream, when can they provide that information? And typically it's all around the researcher and the project team will negotiate a public disclosure date. And it varies widely. Some projects don't have any kind of embargo or wait, others do. And as a downstream kind of middle provider, you are allowed to share that once any of the information is public. And generally, if you're part of the read-in group, you'll be told on this day at 10 a.m. Pacific is when we'll do the public launch. But sometimes it's done through the project will signal through a GitHub commit, and it'll have either a reference to the advisory or talk about the security qualities that's being addressed. So as a middle tier provider, you're authorized to do that when the issue is public. You see, if it shows up on Solar Designer's OSS security list, that's a good indication you're good to go until you're downstream.
Yep. So a lot of the suggestions I saw seem to be targeted towards like middle and larger teams that are managing. what is being done to help communicate to individuals? Because you said there was millions of individual projects. I personally have run across where some person has committed a token and it's on GitHub, and unless they happen to have their social media handle or something that I can track them down with, there's tons of that kind of out there. There's kind of vulnerabilities and passwords sitting out there in plain text, and I can't get in touch with anybody to find out how to do it. So what are we doing to kind of deal with that?
I'll start. So the question was, how are we, a lot of our efforts are focused on large or medium-sized providers or developers. And well, what is organizations like the OpenSSF doing to help those individual contributors that are writing the software? We call them Diana, the weekend warrior, is the persona we use. First and foremost, it's collecting and cataloging all these resources and try to provide training. A project I didn't mention is the foundation has a directed fund called Alpha and Omega, and they are actively approaching critical open source projects or foundations and engaging with those communities, asking, how can we help you? And one of the most successful techniques is, the Python Foundation said, we need help, and Alpha and Omega helped them, and they were able to hire a security developer in residence. And what Seth's doing is he's trying to focus on that whole ecosystem and provide, because he is a developer, he's part of that community, and he's a trusted advisor to developers in that space. And so he is kind of on a spokesperson, an emissary for us, going out into the wild, approaching those developers that work on smaller projects and helping them get set up. And wherever possible, kind of addressing it at anything that's attached to a foundation, we have a little more leverage, or like a package repository, where we try to focus on these things that have a maximum impact. And always we are trying to get out in front of the individual maintainers. Now, I've got some training materials at future conferences, the Open Source Summit in Seattle and hopefully Vienna, where I'll be talking to maintainers, sharing a lot of this information straight to them and teaching them how they can do this stuff and integrate it into their workflows as seamlessly as possible. Anything to add?
Yeah, you'll see that we share a lot of the same information directly with maintainers too. I mean, to your point, if it's a single maintainer that has possibly abandoned the project, us sharing this with them or us being able to reach them is not any more likely than it is for you to be able to reach them. But I think a lot of the efforts that we are working on that will benefit independent solo maintainers the most is what we're doing around automation, especially some of the tooling that we're developing. All-Star, which we had mentioned earlier, is developed into a GitHub action, which then has a number of GitHub apps and actions is both for both of those. There's a number of other automated tools. Oh yeah. Number of other automated tools that we're working on developing throughout the OpenSSF. Of course, those can be leveraged by more mature projects, bigger foundations, but I think that the biggest impact that will have is on the single maintainers who are, overburdened, over capacity. As much as we can do to make it easier for them to manage all of this, to find this information, to know where to start if they find themselves in the middle of an incident, is where I think we're going to have the best impact for those folks.
We address your question? Did we address your question? Awesome.
Hi, everyone. I have a question with regards to, so obviously a lot of this work is being done to provide the information to the open source communities and actually respond, but not as much on like finding vulnerabilities from a responsible perspective. I know particularly like GitHub with, I think it's advanced security, you're now able to like use CodeQL and actually find vulnerabilities and actually suggest fixes. And that reduces a huge amount of burden potentially on those maintainers to actually know how to fix the vulnerability. So where do you see that in the strategy trying to combat the scale that open source is?
So the question was that we have tools and there are capabilities like CodeQL that can be used to help automate the finding of these vulnerabilities before it escapes out into the wild. And what are we doing in particular to try to help provide those to maintainers? And like any good security practitioner, the answer is it depends. CodeQL is a pretty amazing tool, but while my friends at GitHub are wildly popular on the internet, they are not the only repository. So that capability kind of only exists in certain spaces. And we have a lot of other friends. We work a lot with our friends at GitLab and other repositories that also need to be able to kind of have these capabilities. But wherever possible, as we're developing tools or things, we try to make automation, like GitHub Actions is a great way. Things like Dependabot that are just kind of there. You can snap into the pipeline that just work and provide that developer ideally as quick information as possible. And then I work with another project that's on the list called the Security Tool Belt, where we're trying to address the whole software supply chain from creation through staging and publication to consumption and retirement. And through there, one of our mantras is we want the tooling to be automated wherever we can. So if we provide a tool or a recommended practice, we want it to just work for both developers and consumers. Address your question? There's one up here, Steve.
I have one ahead of him.
So can you speak a little bit to like, like best practice and guidance when the CVD process breaks down? Because like not every developer and maintainer is responsive and, willing to patch in a timely fashion.
So the question was, with all these best practices, when does it break down? How can we help kind of overcome that? Is that a good summary? Well, in fact, in our CVD guide for both researchers and maintainers, we explicitly have a section that addresses that, where we have seen challenges, because between us, we have a lot of years in incident response and coordination, and we help provide some of these nuggets to both those personas to try to help them understand where they're going to have some hurdles and how to avoid them. But it's a human process. We are flawed beings, and not everybody reads the manual, and sometimes it gets overlooked.
Does it work? 1, 2, 1, 2. Yeah. Okay. Great talk. Awesome. Thank you very much. My point, I mean, I know you're going to cover that CVE topic also as part of other talks, I think tomorrow, but specifically the advice on maintainers becoming CNAs. Does it hold? Does it scale? Does it actually affect single person maintainers negatively? Is that a strong advice that you really suggest for every open source vendor? No. Okay. So that's clarity already.
So the question and observation is we've seen a trend where open source projects lately, like the Linux kernel, have become their own CNAs. And this is not something we recommend every project to do, because it requires an intense amount of work. Greg KH spent a lot of time and has automated the hell out of the kernel's process to be able to, last time I looked, they were almost 16% of all CVEs issued this year. So they've done a lot of work on automating it. Not every project has that capability, nor do they want to. But for larger projects, and especially those that have a lot of challenges with the CNA CVE process, it's a way for them to control their own destiny. It gives them the right of first refusal. If a CVE is reported, they have a voice to be able to dispute something if they need to. But it is a substantial investment in capability and time for the project to do. And that's why our slide said you could become a CNA or find a CNA to buddy with. There are some CNAs of record that cover open source. Red Hat, GitHub, Google can help. So if a project doesn't want to get into that water, there's friends in the ecosystem that can help them out and manage that. Or even, like the Vulnerability Disclosure Working Group, we provide advice. And if somebody needs help, we're there. We can make connections with experts if the project needs it. Did you answer your question?
Is there another question?
Yeah, but it is a trend, and it's mainly these projects trying to defend themselves against researchers that are randomly dropping things on them. Yeah.
Yeah, one question. Common question. I don't know, in OpenSSF, if this thing ever got finalized on the life cycle of some of the software that's been sitting around for a long time, either never been used, are we able to flag those to tell people that this has not been updated so long? Even GitHub projects, some of them, you see them forked and left there for 15 years, 10 years, or whatever. Not in GitHub, but Is there anything being done in OpenSSF to flag these projects?
So the question was, there's a lot of open source software and it sometimes is maintained a long time and other times isn't. You'll find abandoned projects. You'll find things that aren't well maintained. And is the foundation doing anything to address this? Directly at this time, with some of our projects like All-Star and Scorecard will tell downstream there hasn't been any activity on this project in X amount of days, or this project only has a single maintainer and there haven't been commits in years. And we provide that signaling downstream to understand kind of how that project works. And sometimes that's acceptable. If a project is feature complete, the developer might not feel that they need to do anything else for that project. But unlike a commercial enterprise that typically should have a enterprise support lifecycle, that's not the same for open source, especially like if you're a college kid writing something for your PhD or your thesis, you throw that code out there as an experiment, it's not going to be maintained. So we are working, and there's some efforts like Omar out of Oasis has an idea about how we can more consistently provide that life cycle and end of support information, but that'll have a very long tail trying to get that integrated into upstream maintainers, because everything we ask them to do, will you give us an SBOM? Will you do OpenVex? That is unplanned, unprioritized, unscheduled work for them. And that takes away from their other duties. So it's a challenge. So wherever possible, if we can automate that, give them a tool that does it for them, they can just plug it in and go. That's how we'll be successful. But right now there is not, we provide signaling when something is out of date or not maintained, but we don't have anybody focused specifically on that at this time.
Yeah, our goal is to really provide enough information so that you as the consumer, you as the downstream, you as whatever your role is in this can make a fully informed decision, whether it be to use the software, to not, to integrate it, to not, just so that you have the information that is available so that you can decide. Because again, who am I to tell you, you shouldn't use this? I mean, I will tell you that, but I would like to give you enough information so you can make that decision yourself.
Did we address your question? Any further questions? We have time for maybe one, half one.
Spicy.
Just don't give it to Lisa.
This will be our last one.
Hi, Kayla. So we've focused a lot on upstream here. Question for insights on how we can really motivate downstream to care more about open source. We see it everywhere. It's a main topic. And yet I feel like somewhere in the dialogue, the moment you say open source, the heart and the mind go for the greater good. And we should donate, or, like things like that get cut when you're talking about budget and constraints. And so what tips do we have to motivate downstream to take this a little more seriously?
So the question was, what tips do we have to motivate downstream? Again, I will keep harping on this. I think making this as easy as possible is one way that we can help motivate them. Again, we're asking them to do this, right? We're asking them to be involved in the incident response process, vulnerability disclosure process. If we can make it easy for them to be involved, I think they will be more likely to. And we are unfortunately at time.
We're here all week. Travis in
Yes.
the hall. Thank you for attending. Great.
Thanks, CRob and Madison. Great job. Appreciate it.